It was the kind of morning that promised absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Wednesday, the 12th of January, 2000, in Charlotte, North Carolina. The Charlotte Hornets had just finished a routine practice, the same kind of practice these men had completed hundreds of times before. There was a game coming, there were schedules to keep, film to study, the slow, professional rhythm of an NBA season grinding toward its midpoint. And like men leaving any job on any ordinary day, the players walked out toward the parking lot, climbed into their cars, and pulled away. One of those men was Bobby Phills. He was 30 years old. He had a wife. He had 3 children. He had a long, hard-earned career as a respected defensive guard, the kind of player coaches trusted and opponents hated to face. He was not a headline. He was not a scandal. He was, by every measure, exactly the kind of professional you would never expect to read about in a tragedy. And yet, within minutes of leaving that practice, Bobby Phills was gone. His life ended in a violent, high-speed crash on a road near the Hornets' own arena, feet in the larger sense from the very building where he worked. Pronounced gone at the scene. A man who had walked off a basketball court alive and whole, erased before the next game could even be played. That is what makes this story land so heavily, even now. This was not a fallen superstar consumed by fame. This was not a cautionary tale wrapped in the dark glamour of an earlier era's vices. It was something far more unsettling, sudden, preventable, and painfully normal. A trusted professional man, the kind every locker room wants, ending his life on an ordinary Wednesday on an ordinary stretch of road. How does that happen? How does a respected veteran, a man known for discipline and toughness, lose everything in the space of a few seconds, almost within sight of his own arena? That is the question that haunted the league in 2000, and it is the question that drives everything you are about to hear. But to understand why this final drive shocked an entire league, we have to go back to a boy in Baton Rouge and a player almost nobody wanted. His full name was Bobby Ray Phills II, and he was born on the 20th of December, 1969, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Not a basketball capital, not a place that funneled its sons onto national television and into the recruiting machinery of America's great college programs. Just Baton Rouge, a working city in the Deep South, where a tall, strong, athletic kid could grow up loving the game without the whole country watching. And that matters, because the story of Bobby Phills is, at its heart, the story of a man who was always slightly overlooked, always slightly underestimated, always forced to prove that he belonged. He did not arrive on the national stage as a phenom. He did not have the blue blood programs lining up at his door with scholarship offers and promises of glory. Instead, he stayed close to home and committed to Southern University, a historically black university in Louisiana, a proud institution, but one far outside the bright national spotlight that follows the major conference powerhouses. While future stars were playing in front of sellout crowds and television cameras at the country's most famous arenas, Phills was building his game in relative quiet, away from the hype, away from the easy attention. It would have been easy, in that environment, to disappear entirely. Plenty of talented players do. The path from a smaller program to the professional ranks is narrow and unforgiving. And for every name that breaks through, dozens vanish without a trace. But here is the contradiction that this entire story will keep returning to. The man the NBA would eventually remember, the bruising, fearless defender built like a football player, was not the player Bobby Phills started out as. The reputation that defined the back half of his career would all but bury the truth of how he began. Because before he was a defensive enforcer, Bobby Phills was something almost no one remembers today, and the numbers prove it. Here is the part of the story that surprises almost everyone who only knows the ending. In college, Bobby Phills was not a defensive specialist at all. He was a shooter, A pure, prolific, deep-range gunner, the kind of player who lived and passed away by the three-point line. And not just any shooter. In his senior season at Southern University, Phils led all of college basketball in three-point field goals made per game, hitting over 4.39 of them a night, lead the entire NCAA. That is not a footnote. That is a player whose primary identity was scoring from distance, a man whose hands and stroke were among the very best in the country at putting the ball through the net from far away. Think about that contrast for a moment. The man who would one day be feared for his defense, the man built like an NFL linebacker, the man whose career would be defined by stopping other people from scoring. That same man arrived at the doorstep of professional basketball as one of the deadliest shooters in America. And the shooting never fully left him. It would be tempting to say he abandoned it, that he became a completely different player. But the record tells a more interesting truth. Across his 9-year NBA career, Bobby Phils would shoot 39.0% from the three-point line, a figure that ranks among the top 100 in the entire history of the league. The gunner from Baton Rouge was always still in there, buried under a new reputation, quietly proving that the touch had never really gone away. So this becomes the central puzzle of the man. How does a leading college three-point shooter reinvent himself into a defensive linebacker in the world's toughest basketball league? What kind of mind does that take? What mixture of ego, humility, and raw survival instinct? Because reinvention at that level is not an accident. It is a choice made by a man who understood that to stay in the game, he might have to become someone else entirely. That shooting touch should have made him a hot prospect. So why did he have to wait until the 45th pick to even hear his name called? The 1991 NBA draft should have been a triumph for a player who had just led the nation in three-point shooting. In a fair and tidy world, a marksman like that would have heard his name early, surrounded by family, lifted up as a prized selection. That is not what happened. Bobby Phils was not selected in the first round. He was not selected early in the second round. He waited and waited as pick after pick went by, until finally the Milwaukee Bucks called his name with the 45th overall selection, deep in the second round, near the very bottom of the entire draft. To understand what that number truly meant, you have to understand the brutal math of the NBA at that time. This was a 2-round draft with limited roster spots and almost no patience for long shot prospects. A 45th pick was not a coronation. It was barely an invitation. It came with no guaranteed contract, no protected roster spot, no assurance of so much as a single minute of NBA basketball. It was a chance to fight for a job, nothing more. For a player from a smaller program, taken that late, the odds were merciless. Most men chosen in that range never establish themselves at all. They become names on a list, footnotes in a draft history that the world quickly forgets. The talent that had made Phils the best three-point shooter in college counted for almost nothing against the cold reality of where he was picked and how little it promised. So here was a man who had done everything right, who had led the entire country in his specialty, and who was still being told, in the clearest possible terms, that the league did not believe in him. He would have to earn his place inch by inch, with no margin for error and no safety net beneath him. And it got worse before it got better, because by December of that very first year, the Bucks had already cut him without a single game played. The blow came fast and it came hard. In December of 1991, just months after that draft night, the Milwaukee Bucks cut Bobby Phils loose, released. And here is the detail that cuts the deepest. He never played a single game for them, not one. He had been drafted, brought in, evaluated, and discarded before he could even get his name into an NBA box score. For most men, that is where the story ends. To be cut from the only team that drafted you without ever stepping onto the floor in a real game is the kind of rejection that erases a career before it begins. The league moves on. The phone stops ringing. The dream, so carefully nurtured through years of work, simply dissolves. Fields did not let it dissolve. Instead, he did what only the most stubborn, most determined players are willing to do. He went down to the minor leagues, the Continental Basketball Association, and joined the Sioux Falls Skyforce. This was the basketball wilderness, far from the arenas and the television cameras and the money of the NBA. Long bus rides, small crowds, hard, anonymous work for a man who had been one of the best shooters in the country only a year before. It would have been understandable, even expected, to be bitter, to quietly fade away. But Phils treated the CBA not as a graveyard, but as a proving ground. And he was good. Good enough that in 1992, he earned a place on the CBA All-Rookie team with the Skyforce. In the very place where most discarded prospects disappear forever, Bobby Fields was distinguishing himself, refusing to accept that his story was over. That is the psychology at the core of this man. The same fearless refusal to back down that would later define his defense was already on full display here, in the cold and the obscurity of minor league basketball. He was clawing, fighting, demanding that someone notice him again. But that all-rookie season in Sioux Falls caught one team's attention, and the call he got next would define the rest of his life. The call came from Cleveland. Late in the 1991 to 1992 season, the Cavaliers reached down into the minor leagues and offered the lifeline that every discarded prospect prays for, and almost none receive. They signed him. After the rejection in Milwaukee, after the long bus rides through the Continental Basketball Association, the dream that had nearly passed away was suddenly, miraculously, alive again. He was back in the NBA, not as a celebrated draft pick, but as a fighter who had earned his way through the back door. And the timing mattered. The Cleveland Cavaliers of the early 1990s were not a soft team. This was an era of hard-nosed, physical basketball, where defense was respected and toughness was currency. It was a league of bruising contact, of grinding half-court battles, of players who guarded one another like their livelihoods depended on it, because they did. For a young man trying to stick on a roster, this was both a threat and an opportunity. Soft players were exposed and discarded, but a tough player, a willing player, a man who would do the dirty work others avoided, could carve out a place for himself. That was the environment in which the journeyman from Baton Rouge would build his entire identity. And he did not pass through Cleveland in a season or two. He stayed. He remained a Cavalier through 1997. 5 full seasons of grinding, patient development. 5 years of proving every single night that the team that gave him a chance had not made a mistake. 5 years is not a tryout. 5 years is a career taking root. In that time, a man who had been cut without playing a game became a trusted, dependable professional. The kind of player a coaching staff could rely on when the lights were brightest and the game was on the line. But something else happened during those Cleveland years, something subtle and profound. The player who arrived was not the same player who left. The transformation that would define how the entire league remembered him began quietly, almost invisibly, in those long Ohio seasons. It was in Cleveland that the shooter quietly passed away and the linebacker was born. Look at the man, and the first thing you noticed was the body. He stood 6 feet 5 inches tall and carried 220 pounds of muscle. Observers at the time said it plainly. He did not look like a basketball player at all. He looked like an NFL linebacker who had wandered onto the wrong field, broad through the shoulders, powerful through the chest, built for collision rather than finesse. And that body, told the story of his survival. Because the sweet-shooting marksman from Southern University understood something that destroys lesser players. The role that makes you famous is not always the role that keeps you employed. The NBA was overflowing with scores. What it always needed, what it could never get enough of, were men willing to stop those scores. So he made a choice that most athletes simply cannot make. He let go of the identity that had defined him. He stopped chasing the points and the glory of his college days and turned himself into something harder, something rarer, a tenacious wing defender. Night after night, he took on the most dangerous offensive players the league could offer and made their lives miserable. He used that linebacker frame to bump, to chase, to deny, to wear opponents down until they wanted nothing to do with him. Think about the psychology that requires. To have been the best at one thing and to deliberately set it aside to become useful at another. To trade the applause that comes with scoring for the grinding, thankless labor of defense, where the only people who notice are coaches, teammates, and the frustrated stars you shut down. That is not weakness. That is a profound, almost ruthless self-awareness about what it takes to last. And the league did notice. In 1996, the man who had once been cut without playing a game was named to the NBA All-Defensive Second Team, one of the highest honors a defender can receive, formal recognition that he had become one of the very best stoppers in the world. The transformation was complete. The gunner was gone, replaced by an enforcer the whole league respected. And that reinvention earned him a compliment from a man whose praise was almost impossible to win, Michael Jordan himself. There was a story attached to this part of the legend, and it deserves to be told with care. In the years around 1996, as Phils built his reputation as a defensive stopper, the most fearsome scorer the game has ever known was reportedly impressed. According to reporting at the time, Michael Jordan called Phils the toughest defender he had ever faced. That line, attributed to New York Times reporting dated the 13th of January 2000, the day after Phils passed away, became part of how the basketball world remembered him. But honesty demands a careful hand here. That remark has been repeated for years as if it were carved in stone, yet the truth is more complicated. Jordan, over the course of his long career, spoke highly of more than one defender. He offered similar praise to Joe Dumars of the Detroit Pistons at other points. So this should not be presented as some single, exclusive, lifelong declaration that Phil stood above every other man who ever guarded him. It is better understood as a powerful compliment, reported in the emotional aftermath of a passing from a man who knew exactly how hard Phil's made him work. And perhaps the more grounded truth comes not from Jordan at all, but from Phil's himself. Speaking to the Greensboro News and Record in May of 1998, he described what it took to defend the greatest player alive without flinching. "I think I'm about as strong as he is," he said, "and I move my feet pretty good. I don't back down. That's the most important thing." I don't back down. Listen to those words. There is no boasting in them, no fantasy, just a clear-eyed, professional confidence in his own body, his own footwork, and above all, his own refusal to be intimidated. That was the essence of who he had become, a man who measured himself against the best in the world and simply decided not to give an inch. That mindset, never backing down, never giving an inch, defined how he played the game. But the same fearless streak may hint at something that surfaced on a Charlotte road years later. Strip away the stories and the praise, and what do the cold numbers say about Bobby Ray Phills II? They tell the story of a man who was never a superstar and who never needed to be. Across 9 seasons in the NBA, he averaged 11.0 points, 3.1 rebounds, and 2.7 assists per game. On the surface, those are the figures of a solid, useful contributor, not a leading man, not a name that fills arenas on his own. But that was never the point of him. His value was never going to be measured the way scores are measured. The numbers that mattered most were the ones that revealed his identity. For his career, he averaged 1.3 steals per game, a quiet, persistent reminder of the disruption he caused, the passing lanes he choked off, the offenses he unsettled night after night. That was the linebacker at work, doing the invisible labor that wins games without filling a highlight reel. And then there is the figure that connects the ending of his career back to its very beginning. Despite reinventing himself as a defender, he finished with a three-point shooting percentage of 39.0, a mark that places him among the top 100 shooters in the entire history of the league. The marksman from Southern University never truly vanished. He simply went quiet, surfacing just often enough to remind everyone that the touch had always been there. Put it all together, and you have something the basketball world prizes above almost anything else: the complete role player. A man who could defend the other team's best, knock down an open shot when it mattered, move the ball, and never demand the spotlight for himself. He was not the kind of player you build a franchise around. He was the kind of player you build a winning culture around. The professional whose presence makes everyone else better. The teammate coaches trust without hesitation. By 1997, that complete game made him valuable enough to change cities, and the move to Charlotte would put him on the exact road that ended his life. In 1997, after 5 seasons of building himself into a trusted professional, the journeyman from Baton Rouge left the only NBA team that had ever believed in him. He departed Cleveland and joined the Charlotte Hornets, a new city, a new locker room, a new arena, and a fresh chance to prove that the reputation he had earned in Ohio was not a fluke. For a player who had clawed his way up from the very bottom of a draft and the obscurity of the minor leagues, this was a kind of arrival. Teams do not pursue replaceable men. They pursue veterans they can rely on, the steady hands who set a tone in practice and never need to be managed. That was the role he stepped into in Charlotte. Not a name brought in to score 30 a night, but a defensive guard a coaching staff could trust without a second thought. And he settled in. In Charlotte, he became exactly the kind of locker room presence that holds a team together through the long grind of a season. Younger players watched how he worked. He was, by every account, the consummate professional, punctual, prepared, physical, and respected. The Hornets had brought in a man who understood his job and did it without complaint, and the franchise was better for having him. But there is something else about Charlotte that has to be said now, quietly, before the story turns. It is the geography. The Hornets arena sat in the heart of the city, surrounded by the ordinary roads that any working man drives every single day, to the building, away from the building, to and from a job. Those streets meant nothing to anyone. They were simply the route home from practice, the unremarkable pavement that a professional athlete travels without a second thought. That is the cruel detail that makes this chapter ache in hindsight. The very place that gave him a new beginning, the city where he was respected and settled and at the peak of his standing, was also the place that held the road waiting for him. He did not know it. No one did. To everyone in that organization, Charlotte was simply where Bobby Phills worked and lived and belonged. And it was in Charlotte that he formed one of the closest friendships of his career, with the very teammate who would be driving in front of him on his final day. Every locker room has its pairs, the two men who gravitate toward each other, who share the same position, the same mindset, the same daily rhythm. In Charlotte, that pairing was Bobby Phills and a guard named David Wesley. They were backcourt mates, and by all accounts, genuine friends. They shared the grind together, the practices, the travel, the endless repetition of an NBA season.
Two professionals who understood one another's games, who pushed each other in drills, who competed side by side night after night. The kind of bond that forms when men spend nearly every working hour in each other's company, fighting for the same goals. And here, we have to step carefully, because this friendship sits at the very center of the tragedy that is coming. It would be easy, knowing the ending, to rush ahead and assign blame. But the honest version of this story respects what was true at the time. These were two competitive athletes, close companions, who shared not only a profession, but apparently a streak of competitiveness that did not always switch off when practice ended.
That competitive fire is part of what made them the players they were. It is also, in the harshest light of what followed, part of what makes this story so painful. What matters in this chapter is the human texture, not the verdict. Two friends, two teammates, two men who, on an ordinary working morning, would finish their jobs and head out into the same Charlotte streets at roughly the same moment, the way they surely had countless times before. There was nothing remarkable about that. There was nothing that should have set off an alarm. Wesley's role in what happened would later become the subject of a police report and criminal proceedings, a matter for courts and investigators to weigh in their own time with their own evidence. But all of that lay ahead. In the moment we are describing now, there was only friendship, routine, and the easy familiarity of two men who trusted each other. On the morning of the 12th of January, 2000, the two of them finished an ordinary practice and walked to their cars, and that is where the final countdown began. There was nothing about that Wednesday that anyone would have remembered, if not for what came after. The 12th of January, 2000, in Charlotte, North Carolina, a regular in-season practice day. The Hornets had work to do, as they always did, with another game waiting on the schedule ahead of them. The men arrived, they trained, they ran through whatever a coaching staff puts professional players through in the middle of a long campaign. And then practice ended. That is all. A working morning, indistinguishable from 100 others. This is the part of the story that unsettles people most, even now. There was no warning, no premonition, no dark cloud hanging over the building, no sense in the air that something terrible was about to unfold. There was no scandal brewing, no crisis playing out behind closed doors. It was, in the truest and most haunting sense, painfully normal, the kind of day so ordinary that it should have been forgotten entirely. And that is exactly what makes it so hard to absorb. We expect tragedy to announce itself. We expect in hindsight to find the signs, the warning that everyone missed, the bad feeling someone had, the moment that hinted at what was coming. Here, there was none of that. There was only a team finishing its work and a group of grown men walking out to the parking lot, car keys in hand, thinking about lunch, about the next game, about the small and forgettable concerns of an ordinary day. For Bobby Phills, this was simply Wednesday. He had a wife waiting. He had 3 children. He had a long career still in front of him, and every reason to believe the routine would repeat itself again the next morning, and the morning after that, the way routines always seem to promise they will. But routines make no promises. The contrast between how mundane that morning was and how catastrophic its ending would be is the very heart of this story, the reason it has lingered in the memory of the league for so long. 2 cars pulled out of the practice facility that morning, and within minutes, one of them would be traveling at more than 100 miles per hour. What happened next unfolded on a road near the Hornets arena, on the same ordinary stretch of Charlotte pavement that these men drove every working day. According to the official record and the contemporaneous reporting that followed, Bobby Phills was driving a Porsche, traveling behind his teammate David Wesley, and the speed described in those records is staggering to consider on a public road in the middle of a city. Over 100 miles per hour. Not slightly over a limit, not the small excess of a man running a few minutes late. A velocity far beyond anything the human body or any ordinary vehicle is built to survive when something goes wrong. And at those speeds, the margin for error does not shrink, it vanishes entirely. There is no time to react, no room to correct, no second chance. The physics are merciless and indifferent. A car moving that fast covers the length of a basketball court in a fraction of a second, and the smallest loss of control becomes irreversible before a driver can even register that anything has happened. That is precisely what the record describes. At that tremendous speed, Phil's Porsche spun, control was lost, and the car crossed over into oncoming traffic, into the path of vehicles being driven by people who had done nothing wrong, who were simply going about their own ordinary day with no idea what was hurtling toward them. It is important to sit with the sober reality of this and not dress it up. This was not a stunt on a closed track.
This was a city road, near an arena, in the middle of an afternoon, with other lives moving through the same space. The official language would later wrestle with what those two cars had been doing and why. But the raw fact, stripped of interpretation, is simply this. A vehicle traveling at over 100 miles per hour lost control and crossed into the lane of traffic coming the other way. Everything that defined the danger had now converged. The speed, the road, the oncoming cars, the friend driving ahead. The next moment would decide everything. What happened in the next 2 seconds would involve 3 vehicles, 2 survivors, and 1 fatality that stopped the NBA cold. The official record describes what followed in cold, mechanical terms, and there is no gentle way to soften the sequence of impacts that took a man's life in a matter of seconds. When the Porsche crossed the center line and entered the path of traffic moving the other way, it struck another vehicle head-on. That collision alone carried the force of 2 moving objects meeting at speeds the human frame is simply not built to withstand. But the chain did not stop there. The car that Phil's Porsche had struck was, in turn, hit from behind by a minivan, a third vehicle drawn into a wreck it had no part in causing, no way to anticipate, no chance to avoid. 3 vehicles, 1 ordinary stretch of Charlotte Road. A few seconds that rearranged everything. And here, the documented outcomes must be stated plainly, without embellishment, because the plainness is what makes them land. The drivers of the other 2 vehicles, the people whose afternoons were shattered through no fault of their own, survived. They recovered. They went on. Their families did not receive the call that ends a life as they have known it. Bobby Phil's did not survive. He was pronounced gone at the scene. Read that again and let the geography of it sink in. Not in a hospital after a desperate fight by surgeons. Not days later after a vigil. At the scene. On the road. Within sight, in the larger sense, of the very building where he had finished a routine practice less than an hour before. A working professional, 30 years old, alive and whole at his job that morning, was gone on the pavement near his own arena before the day's light had even begun to fade. That is the immediacy that stunned everyone who heard it. There was no warning to brace against, no illness to prepare a family, no slow decline. One moment, a respected veteran was driving home from work. The next, he was a fatality at a crash site, and an entire league was about to learn that one of its own had been erased between practices. But almost immediately, investigators focused on a single chilling phrase in the police report and on the question of what those 2 cars had really been doing. When the authorities reconstructed the events of that afternoon, their findings were recorded in language that would shadow this case from that point forward. According to the police report, the 2 drivers, Phil's and his teammate David Wesley, had been operating their vehicles, in the report's own words, in an erratic,
reckless, careless, negligent, or aggressive manner. Sit with that phrase, because every word of it carries weight. Erratic, reckless, careless, negligent, aggressive. This was not the dry, neutral description of an unavoidable accident. It was an official account that pointed deliberately and unmistakably toward conduct, toward the way these two cars were being driven on a public road in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. And from that language grew the question that would come to define the entire tragedy. Had the two friends been racing? It is a question that must be handled with care because it sits at the boundary between what was documented and what was alleged. What the record establishes is the speed, the manner of driving described by investigators, and the fact that two teammates were traveling close together when control was lost. What followed from there, the suspicion that this was not merely fast driving, but a contest between two competitive men, became the central allegation, the haunting possibility that this catastrophe was born not of mechanical failure or bad luck, but of a moment of shared recklessness between friends. That suspicion changed everything about how the story would be told. A tragic accident is one kind of loss. A preventable one, rooted in choices made by two grown men who knew better, is something far harder to bear. The word racing was never going to stay confined to a report. It was going to move into a courtroom where intent and speed and responsibility would be argued by lawyers and weighed by a justice system, with one of the men involved no longer alive to give his account. That single allegation would put David Wesley, Bobby's friend and teammate, in front of a court of law, fighting a charge that could redefine the entire tragedy. Consider for a moment the impossible position in which David Wesley now found himself. He had lost a close friend and teammate in the most sudden and violent way imaginable. The two of them had shared a backcourt, a locker room, the daily grind of an NBA season. And now, in the rawest period of that grief, Wesley was not simply a mourner, he was a defendant. He stood accused in connection with the very event that had taken his friend's life, including a charge that the two had been racing on that Charlotte road. There are few human situations more wrenching than that. To bury a friend while simultaneously standing before a court answerable for the circumstances of his passing. To carry the private weight of loss and the public weight of legal jeopardy at the same moment, with the eyes of an entire league and a grieving family fixed upon you. The legal process worked through the questions that the police report had raised. And the documented outcome matters because it drew a careful line between what could be proven and what could not. David Wesley was cleared of the racing charge. The court did not establish, to the standard the law requires, that the two men had been engaged in a race. But he did not walk away unmarked. Wesley was convicted of reckless driving. The justice system, in the end, found him responsible for the manner in which he had operated his vehicle that day. A verdict that fell short of racing, yet still affixed accountability for conduct that the law deemed dangerous. That distinction, cleared of one charge, convicted of another, is the legal heart of this tragedy. It did not deliver a tidy answer. It did not satisfy everyone, and it could not. No verdict could undo what had happened on that road, and no courtroom could resolve the deeper, unanswerable questions that hung over two friends and one terrible afternoon. While the courts argued over speed and intent, a young widow and 3 children were left to face an emptier truth. The man who left for practice was never coming home. Strip away the police report, the courtroom, the headlines, and the league-wide shock, and what remains is the simplest and most devastating fact of all. A family was waiting for a man who would never walk through the door again. He was survived by his parents, who would now know the unnatural grief of outliving their own son. He was survived by his wife, Kendall, and he was survived by 3 children, a daughter, Brittany, a son, Bobby Ray Fields III, known to those close to him as Trey, and another daughter, Kirsty. 3 children, suddenly without a father. A wife, suddenly a widow. He had been 30 years old. His children were young, far too young to fully grasp what had been taken from them, far too young to understand why the man who had left for an ordinary day of work simply did not return. This is where the weight of the story truly settles, away from the speed and the impacts and the legal arguments over intent. Because for all the public dimensions of this loss, the retired number that would come, the league's mourning, the courtroom drama, the deepest wound was the one felt inside a single home. A husband gone, a father gone, not through illness that gave warning, not through some long decline that allowed for goodbyes, but in an instant, on a road, on a day that should have been entirely forgettable. How does a family absorb a loss this sudden and this preventable? There is no manual for it. There is no process that makes sense of a man finishing practice and never coming home. The very ordinariness that defined that morning becomes its own kind of cruelty in hindsight. The breakfast, the routine, the goodbyes that no one knew were final because there was no reason on earth to think they were. That is the painful truth the courts could never address and the headlines could never capture. That somewhere, a wife and 3 children had to learn how to live in a house shaped by an absence that arrived without warning. The franchise responded with something it had never done in its entire history, and it happened less than a month later. In the weeks after the crash, the Charlotte Hornets did something that no version of this franchise had ever done before. They took a number off the floor forever. On the 9th of February 2000, less than a month after that ordinary Wednesday turned catastrophic, the Hornets retired the number 13, the number their fallen guard had worn. And here is the detail that gives the gesture its true weight. It was the first jersey the organization had ever retired. Not one player in the entire history of the franchise had been honored this way before. The first name lifted into permanence was not a scoring champion or a franchise cornerstone celebrated across decades. It was a respected defensive guard, taken at 30, whose career had been built on grit rather than glory. That choice said something profound about how this man was regarded. Teams retire numbers for many reasons, for points, for titles, for years of marquee stardom. The Hornets did it for something harder to measure: respect. The kind a locker room reserves for the professional who set the tone, who never backed down, who made everyone around him better simply by showing up the way he did. And the timing of the ceremony carried its own quiet ache. The Hornets held it at halftime of a home game, and the opponent that night was the Cleveland Cavaliers, the very team that had pulled him out of the minor league wilderness and given him 5 years to become who he was. The franchise that discovered him and the franchise that lost him, standing in the same building on the same evening as his number rose to the rafters. There could hardly have been a more fitting witness to the moment. The tribute did not end there. For the rest of that 1999 to 2000 season, the Hornets wore a patch bearing his number 13 on their jerseys, a small daily reminder stitched over the heart, carried onto the floor through every remaining game of a season that would never feel whole again. But the story of that number was not finished, because 14 years later, the Hornets would feel the need to retire it all over again. It is one of the strangest footnotes in this entire story, and it requires a little understanding of how a franchise can lose and reclaim its own identity. On the 1st of November, 2014, the Charlotte Hornets retired the number 13 a second time, not because the first honor had been a mistake, not because anyone had forgotten, but because the franchise itself had traveled a complicated road in the years between, a road of relocation, of name changes, of an identity that had been packed up, set down elsewhere, and eventually reborn in the city where this guard had played his final seasons. When the modern Hornets re-established themselves and reclaimed the name and history that belonged to Charlotte, they faced a decision about the honors of the past. They could have let the original gesture stand quietly in the record books. Instead, they chose to do it again, to formally, publicly, deliberately lift that number back into the rafters under the restored identity, so there could be no ambiguity about where this man belonged in the story of Charlotte basketball. Think about what that second ceremony truly meant. Most honored players are retired once and remembered through the steady passage of time. This guard was honored twice by a franchise that had every reason to simply let history sit, but felt compelled to reaffirm it. A number retired once is a tribute. A number retired twice is a statement that some absences refuse to fade, that some men are not allowed to slip quietly into the past. Today, that number hangs in the rafters of the Spectrum Center, the Hornets' home arena, a permanent fixture above the floor where the team still plays. Fans who never saw him guard the league's best scorers, who were not even alive on that January afternoon, look up and see it there. It is no longer just a tribute to a player. It has become a piece of the building itself, a quiet, fixed point of memory that the years have not been able to erase. And while the jersey hung in the rafters, a small boy who lost his father at the age of 4 was growing into a player who would carry the family name back toward the NBA. When his father passed away, Bobby Ray Fields III, known to everyone as Trey, was just a small child, far too young to hold a clear memory of the man whose name he carried. He would grow up in the shadow of an absence, in a home reshaped by a loss that arrived in an instant. And what he did with that inheritance is the most quietly hopeful thread in this entire story. Trey grew up to play the game his father had given his life to. In North Carolina, he earned statewide recognition at Charlotte Christian School, making a name of his own in the very state where his father had once worn that retired number. He was not simply trading on a famous surname. He was building a reputation through his own performance, on his own court, in front of people who remembered exactly what the name Phils had meant to Charlotte. From there, his path took a turn that spoke to a different kind of family value. He went on to play college basketball at Yale University, one of the most demanding academic institutions in the country. That choice blended athletics with scholarship, the hardwood with the classroom, and it suggested a young man raised to value more than just the game. To compete at that level, in that environment, required discipline and seriousness of a kind his father would surely have recognized. And then, the family name returned to the professional basketball world. Trey went on to play in the NBA's G League, the developmental tier of the very league his father had fought so hard to reach, suiting up for the Greensboro Swarm. There was a deep and almost unbearable symmetry in that. A son who had lost his father to the game's wider world before he could truly know him, stepping onto professional courts of his own, carrying the same name forward into the same sport. That a son could rise that far from such a sudden loss says everything about what Bobby Phils built and why his story refuses to be forgotten. Trace the whole arc of his life now, from start to finish, and a single truth comes into focus. He began as an overlooked shooter from a smaller program in Louisiana, the leading three-point marksman in all of college basketball one season, drafted so late that the league barely seemed to want him. He was cut without ever playing a game, banished to the minor leagues, and forced to claw his way back through obscurity that erases most men entirely. He reinvented himself completely, surrendering the gunner's identity to become a feared defensive stopper, a 6'5" frame built like a linebacker, honored on the league's all-defensive team in 1996. He became the trusted veteran every locker room craves, the professional whose presence steadied a franchise. And it all ended on an ordinary road near his own arena on a Wednesday that should have been forgotten. That is the reason this loss still lands so heavily. He was not a fallen icon undone by fame, nor a cautionary tale of an earlier era's dark glamour. He was respected, disciplined, professional, about as far from a tragic figure as a man could seem. And that is precisely what makes the ending so hard to absorb. If it could happen to him on a normal afternoon in a few unguarded seconds, then it carries a warning that no one is entirely beyond. How fast everything a person has built can vanish. What he left behind speaks for itself. A number, 13, retired not once but twice, still hanging in the Spectrum Center today. A reputation as one of the finest perimeter defenders of his time, paired with a three-point stroke so true that his 39% career mark still ranks among the top 100 in league history. The complete player, remembered exactly as he was. A grieving family who had to learn to live around an absence, and a son who carried the name forward all the way back toward the league. So remember the man behind the headline, not just the shocking way it ended, but the long, stubborn, dignified climb that came before it. Bobby Fields earned every inch of the life he built, and he deserves to be known for how he lived, not only for how suddenly it was taken. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it moved you, stay with us. There is another life, another investigation waiting to be told.